Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Senate Education. It's Tuesday, January 11th at 3:30. Just quickly want to let those witnesses who are waiting that we are going to end today at 4. The Senate chairs are meeting at 4. And so we will dedicate this last half hour to our two guests, Secretary French and Dr. Levine. And others, Daphne will be in contact with all of you to reschedule tomorrow. I think she's looking at 2:30. With that, Dr. French, Dr. Levine, great to see both of you. Thanks for being with us. It's been too long. We did not, because we were in committee, and actually I think during the press conference, many of us were caucusing. We didn't have an opportunity to be there in person, so or to listen. So I'm wondering, the floor is yours for the next 30 minutes, however you'd like to do this. But ideally, it would be terrific just for you to roll out what you've proposed and talk a little bit about the science and the policy behind it. And the floor is yours, and we'll take some questions.
Good afternoon. Maybe this is Dan French, Secretary of Education. Dr. Levine, it's all right. I'll jump in and we go from there. I'm sure you're aware we've announced a major change in our policy for schools, and we're in the process of enacting that and rolling it out. Really 2 points behind the decision, and I'll invite Dr. Levine to chime in on one of the points. One point would be just the operational strain on schools that we've seen. And I should say, back up a little bit, really what we're talking about is a shift in contact tracing and testing. If I think about our layered approach to mitigation this year, there's really 3 layers. One is vaccine, that's our primary one. Number 2 would be contact tracing and testing. And then number 3 would be our mitigation recommendations, if you will. So it's really that middle one, number 2, that we're taking a look at in this significant revision in our policy shift. So to talk about contact tracing and testing, again, I think 2 variables. One would be the operational strain, if you will, on schools to implement contact tracing and testing. And we started this school year using contact tracing like we always had and successfully had in the year prior. I think Delta really challenged that for a number of reasons. Certainly the larger number of cases were part of that. I think another key piece, particularly since we call on school nurses to implement contact tracing, is just the fatigue that exists in our society, and to what extent parents in particular were interested in cooperating with nurses on that. And it was a really challenging and started to become more challenging as we got further into Delta for our schools to sustain that activity. We then did identify the use of antigen tests, I think, for the first time in schools in the form of this program called Test to Stay. From my perspective, that was very successful, particularly in keeping more students in school. But here too, it put more work on school nurses and logistics in school to operate. So the logistics and the operational strains on schools were well on our radar, but we maintained those programs moving forward because we assumed to a certain extent they were efficacious in helping us keep things safe, but also keeping kids in school. And from my perspective, this is where I'll invite Dr. Levine to comment. We came out of the holiday, with Omicron starting to really make an impact across the country and in Vermont, and then certainly in our schools. As we were starting to evaluate more closely the operational strain on schools as a result of Omicron, the EPI team and the public health experts at Dr. Levine's office started to weigh in a bit on to what extent contact tracing was as effective as it needed to be in order to justify the amount of time we're putting on it. So that led us to this policy point. So maybe Dr. Levine, if you want to comment a little bit on the public health mitigation implications of contact tracing and testing relative to Omicron.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark Levine, Commissioner of Health. The bottom line is the goal has always been and continues to be keeping kids in school for in-person learning. And we're at a very disruptive time right now during the course of the pandemic. The pandemic has had its slow moments where we get lulled into security, and then it has its very fast moving moments where people get more anxious and energized. And we need to be nimble and be able to make decisions quickly and adapt to changing circumstances. The circumstances with Omicron are unlike any we've had with the virus in its previous versions, if I could call it that. So really, with a virus variant that is highly contagious, has a very short incubation period, spreads rapidly through the population, school population included, but the population at large, and may, as we do believe, have less serious outcomes, especially for youth. We really wanted to adapt to that and be very nimble and make changes that would enhance the opportunity for kids to stay in the in-school learning environment. So we basically looked at contact tracing, which, unlike the speed of this variant, is actually a very slow process. It's very labor intensive. I don't mind saying it had most of the school nurse workforce ready to quit at any moment in time. And it's really testimony to their fortitude that they're still all with us. And we wanted to do something that was not so outdated and outpaced by Omicron. So people have interpreted this inappropriately as we have given up on contact tracing, and that is completely untrue. We have really evolved contact tracing to the point where it is now, I think, a much more conservative approach and a more comprehensive approach. Basically, when a case is identified in a class, the entire class are considered contacts right from the get-go. Now, you're also aware that contact tracing has been paired with testing, because obviously people wanted to know if they truly were cases or not. And when they were in quarantine, they wanted to test out of quarantine successfully. So the testing system that is in place isn't adequate to the task either of confronting this very fast variant. And so we have a variant that moves so fast. We have a testing system with PCR, which in the schools was often a surveillance testing system that really can't pick up the cases with the rapidity to intervene in an epidemic kind of setting. So basically, contact tracing evolves into utilizing rapid testing in the form of antigen testing, especially at a time like now when community transmission is really high. And so basically, if the schools can become the center for distributing test kits, not doing the tests like the school nurses were so often involved in, but distributing test kits in an appropriate manner to students and their families, one can then take the results of contact tracing and translate that into immediate action. So if a contact traced student in a class that had a case is unvaccinated, and that student wants to stay in school and not have to quarantine at home, they can do antigen tests consecutive days, 5 days in a row. And if they're all negative and the student's asymptomatic, they're able to go to school. Likewise, if a vaccinated student is asymptomatic and their parents just want to know if they actually are infected, or if they want to abide by our public health guidance to the general population, which is you don't have to quarantine if you've been fully vaccinated and boosted, but you do have to get a test on day 5 to assess your status at that point. You'll have a kit to do that as well. We also envision if students have identified as close contacts outside the school, they'll be able to also do some testing. And we're trying to stretch this to the staff as well, whether the staff are vaccinated or unvaccinated. And that's the last piece of the puzzle to fit in, because obviously you may not want to get into questions today, but there's a lot of issues around supply chain. And we feel very comfortable with our supply chain for the students and families at the schools for the next several weeks. We would love to be able to extend that to the faculty and staff as well. So essentially, that's the public health rationale for why these modifications have been made. They're very responsive to the changing times we're in. They confront Omicron real time now, as opposed to sitting there and letting schools close and classes close and kids stay at home for weeks and weeks. It's really an action-oriented kind of profile. And it still builds on all the mitigation strategies that the schools continue to have, like stay home if you're sick, wear a mask all the time universally at the school setting. So I'll turn it back to Secretary French now.
You're muted, Mr. Secretary.
Just to sort of wrap that and open it up for questions. So that's the rationale. We made the announcement on Friday that we're going to be working on it and putting out more information, which is essentially like most things we've been doing in the pandemic, a communications exercise. There's a lot of logistics going on in the background. As Dr. Levine highlighted, the issue of supply chain has been with us throughout the pandemic, but this is an important precondition for doing this, and we feel comfortable heading into the next couple of weeks that we've secured the supplies. We put out messaging to school districts this morning that those supply kits should start kicking in this week to Vermont schools. We have quite a bit of work to do on our communications relative to guidance documents and so forth and the templated forms. And that's where a lot of the work is heading now in the next 24 hours. Yeah, it's going to be a major pivot. As Dr. Levine mentioned, there's, I think, a strong public health rationale for doing it. And I think more importantly, from an operational standpoint, it's going to give particularly our school nurses some hope that this is going to be more manageable. Dr. Levine and I both met with the leadership of the School Nurse Association yesterday, and they seem very supportive generally and receptive. They too have a lot of questions, which a lot of logistics we're seeking to address. But I think it's fair to say this is an important pivot in our response, but one that's likely to set us up for success. Certainly, we couldn't stay where we were, so we have to make an adjustment. And why don't I end there and be happy to answer any questions.
And I'll just add that I noticed you have Dr. Lee on the line as well, and he's a pediatric infectious disease specialist. He and Dr. Bell, who is the head of the Academy of Pediatrics for Vermont chapter, she was at the press conference today. There's complete alignment in the clinical community and the public health community and the education community, or at least the education administration of the state on these plans.
Thank you for that. And one of the things I announced right when we got started, Dr. Lee will be joining us tomorrow, as will some of our other stakeholders, just given some timing issues. Senator Terenzini. Excuse me.
Thank you, Senator Campion. Dr. Levine, in all of the modeling that you folks are doing, do you have any sort of estimation when you think we're going to be sort of on a downward slide here with Omicron, and where we're going to feel like we're in a better position?
Yeah, please join me in being skeptical of modeling. But at the same time, I will answer your question because really, I will use my hands in this way. This is how modeling looks right now. It could go this way, it could go this way, but it's probably somewhere in between. And the modeling that we reviewed today, which comes from a lot of people who contribute to CDC in terms of an overall model, basically says we're talking through the end of January for this surge, that it will continue to go up till the end of January. If there's going to be a downslope, which we assume there is going to be in our near future, it will be in the early part of February. And that would be the beginning of the downslope. So clearly the whole month of January, we need to be on our game with regard to what we presented here. And general population wise, that means, many thousands of cases a day in Vermont. It means 1 million cases a day in the country. And keep in mind, most of the cases in school are not being transmitted by student to student in the classroom. They're coming in from the community into the school. So that's the context you need to have.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Terenzini. Senator Perslet.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to clarify, did any of the announcement on Friday or at the press conference today, which I didn't hear, were there any changes to the quarantine protocol if somebody is a contact in a school? or was that totally untouched?
I think Dr. Levine can speak to that. That transition started to happen over the holiday with the CDC's pivot. In Vermont followed through with an adjustment in our own. But it is important to underscore that is an important feature of, and I didn't highlight it, but it's an important feature of our revision. There's a close connection between how we see this sort of revised contact tracing process or response notification process happening relative to antigen testing. And it all ties back to this, I would say, revised definition of isolation and quarantine that health department has developed.
Can you just go over that, maybe Dr. Levine or Secretary French? If you're a student in a class and somebody tests positive, what is the requirement for quarantining if you're vaccinated?
So if you're vaccinated, and for the CDC's purpose and our purpose, we use the word fully vaccinated, which means you've gotten the 2 doses of the 2-dose series, but you don't have to be boosted yet if you're a student in a school. None of those people need to quarantine if they are asymptomatic. The only people that need to quarantine are unvaccinated students or not fully vaccinated students, because they may have received one dose. And those students can test out each day if their test is negative.
But even if you're vaccinated and you don't quarantine, you come to school the next day, did I hear you say that you still need to do a test on day 5 and show that?
Yeah, that's the recommendation for the general population, so it would hold for the school population too. It's not a rigid mandate though,
Right,
but
so
it is
like
our
schools aren't
version
required
of the
to try to-
CDC. Pardon me?
The schools aren't required to try to police that. Like,
No, in fact, the schools aren't actually policing even the daily antigen testing. They're
Right.
counting on the integrity and cooperation of their entire school community and following through on that, knowing that they're providing all the supplies for them.
okay, thanks.
Senator Hooker.
Thank you. And either of you, how will this new system affect data collection, do you anticipate?
Yeah, specifically, Senator, I think you're speaking to collection of cases in schools. Yeah, and that's, I think it's fair to say that that's going to change. I think Delta challenged our data collection. I think you might have caught on to that. Some of the media have. We saw significant delays in our ability to contact trace and therefore assign cases to schools. So any case that the health department was capturing through PCR testing or so is ultimately captured in our data, state level data, but then that assignment of a case, was the person infectious at school, versus being infectious in some other setting, that kind of decision making in terms of categorizing the data came through to contact tracing largely, or the EPI team following up. And Delta really started to challenge the accuracy of that information. There was often time delays and so forth, because we were just doing that on a once a week basis through the health department's website. The rub of this new policy is that since schools are not going to be administering the testing, we're going to lose control of some of the data, meaning we're not going to have as accurate data as the number of cases in schools. On the other hand, what we are going to do, I think, from a public health perspective, is deploy more testing in the broader public. So it is a bit of a trade-off, but in the end, I think it's the better approach relative to public health and safety.
Senator Hooker, did you have a follow-up? Are you okay?
And I would imagine that a parent whose kid's test is positive has to give a reason for why the kid isn't coming to school. It's they're absent for the day or whatever number of days. So they're going to be in communication about the results of those tests to the school. So the school will have eyes on that. The state will not have eyes on every case, just like we don't now. When you or another legislator does a test at home, if you decide to enter the form in on the public health website, we'll know you did a test and what your result was. But it's not estimated that we're going to get a high percentage of those cases that way.
Okay, so I guess I do have a follow-up. So you have a positive case in a classroom and that class is considered close contact, every child in that class gets tests for how many days?
Yeah, I think, firstly to your original question, and that if a student was symptomatic in school, went to the nurse kind of thing, the nurse would probably end up, and I'm sure would, report that data. So we would have insight into that, in terms of capturing that kind of data. I think what we sort of reacted to immediately was the idea of if there's testing happening at home, we're going to lose touch with some of that data. But in terms of the scenario you just outlined, if we have a symptomatic case, what we're asking schools to do is notify parents in that classroom. And we have to work on this relative to high school a little differently. So I'll use the example of elementary. I think it's a little easier to understand. The average elementary student, they're in one classroom for most of the day. So parents would receive notification, and this notification letter really draws a distinction between the vaccination status of your child. As Dr. Levine mentioned, you're notified that your child was in a classroom where there was a case. Then your decision making is really based on to what extent your child, potential contact, is vaccinated or not. And the notification letter describes, what you should do in either scenario. So if you're vaccinated, there's no requirement that you get tested on a daily basis. It's really the unvaccinated student that's the focus of this policy. They're the ones that would then be, we'd say to that parent, swing by the school office or wherever that distribution point is and pick up a series of test kits. And they're available to you for using every single day during this 5-day period. If you're negative, you can keep coming to school on every single day. On the other hand, if you were a parent who didn't want to participate in that, because, similar to Test to Stay, participation in that testing program is voluntary. If you didn't want to participate in that antigen testing process, then you would be recommended that you follow the isolation quarantine guidelines. In this case, the quarantine guidelines, if you're not positive, that all Vermonters would be recommended to follow, which is the 5 days, and you could shorten it with a test on the other side of that.
Okay. Thank you.
Senator Perschlick.
Thank you, Chair. I had a question about masks. So my understanding is right now, Department of Health, Agency of Education is recommending masks, but it's not a requirement, right, in any school. And do we still have one school district that decided not to require it, or are all schools now requiring it?
Yeah, our guidance recommends that school districts require masks. And to my knowledge, there's only one school district, Canaan School District, that has not had their district adopt that.
Okay, just clarification on that. And then for the Department of Health or Education, is there a concern about the quality of masks? I see some articles suggesting that people should double mask, or because of the characteristics of Omicron, that maybe better masking is more important than it was before. So I don't know if Department of Health is recommending better masks, or is just fine with telling people they recommend masking. And if better masks are recommended, has the Agency of Education thought about getting better masks out to the schools, which we heard from the NEA today as something that they'd like to see?
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Levine can speak to the masking. He spoke a bit at the press conference today. It's almost like you're not here, Dr. Levine, and I'm speaking. It's wonderful experience.
Can you imagine that all of these legislators felt that they couldn't take time off to watch us for 2.5 hours?
I know.
I can't imagine.
Well, my plan tonight is the usual. I pour myself a stiff drink and I turn your press conferences on, and I try to go to bed, sleep to them, and then I wake up to them as well.
Yeah.
This one was a marathon.
Okay.
Yeah, I would, and I'll just try to consolidate. I would invite Dr. Levine to comment, but yeah, I think we're seeing that, and my observation and consumer of medical expertise being in many meetings with Dr. Levine, and just consuming the national and international thinking on this. Yes, there's increased emphasis on a higher quality mask that's appearing. part of what I was referring to in terms of our next job is to sort of clean up I won't say clean up, but to make modifications to our guidance documents and so forth. We'll visit this question and I'm sure we'll make some adjustment or new emphasis on masks in our revision to the mitigation recommendations for schools. In terms of supply, we have, firstly, supply is not constrained on masks, good quality masks right now. They're readily available. So that's one area the state would get involved. We have been involved in PPE procurement in the past when, supplies have been constrained, and sometimes government can get involved and help in that regard. So right now that's not a problem. The other area I think we would probably get involved is if there wasn't money available to purchase them. And that too is not my impression either, that locals, have the bulk of the ESSER funding, and that's likely where that be resolved. So unless the supply really becomes constrained on that, my impression is that locals will become more involved in securing those supplies on their own, particularly because they can do it a heck of a lot quicker than we can from the state level. But we'll reassess that in particular as our guidance comes out with a renewed emphasis. But right now, knock on wood, I don't see it either being a supply issue or an issue of finances.
And Senator Perklick, you stated it exactly as I would state it, that the run-of-the-mill cloth mask is no longer adequate to the task for Omicron. So N95 would be wonderful, but not absolutely necessary. A surgical mask would be fine. A cloth mask over a surgical mask would be fine, but just not a one-ply cloth mask. Not going to cut it.
All right, thanks.
One of the other issues that came up this morning was the need for rapid tests. I may have missed part of this. Is there a supply chain issue with rapid tests? Are we going to be able to, acquire the numbers that we're going to need?
Yeah, when we say rapid tests, I mean, there's, from my perspective, two flavors of that. One are the antigen tests, which we've been talking about, and the other is LAMP tests, which is a test that amplifies nucleic material of the virus and is a confirmable test, comparable, I would say, to PCR, though, albeit not as sensitive, but it's quick. So we get the results immediately. So LAMP test supplies much more constrained or complex, but we're comfortable and we're securing more supply of that. And again, I'd invite Dr. Levine to color in the comments. Antigen tests, very dynamic supply chain moment. We're securing. We feel sufficient because there is a policy priority for K-12. We feel we've secured sufficient supply for the immediate couple of weeks to implement the policy, and we're been quite aggressive considering we're such a small state in doing that. The governor announced today our pilot program with NIH and Amazon.com, which I believe goes live tomorrow. So it's part of a broader supply chain question. I mean, and the supply chain issues have been with us throughout the pandemic, but certainly there's a broader emphasis happening from the federal and government down to provide better access to antigen tests. So I think you're going to see those issues start to percolate as we simultaneously are working on this revised approach with schools. Dr. Levine, you have anything to add to supply chain issues? Or
I think that was well done.
We're going to probably go another 10 minutes. If those of you that do need to leave for a chair's meeting, feel free to do so. I would say that the other outstanding question from, I think, our Senate colleagues has to do with, and something we've heard today a little bit, the superintendents needing to pivot in this waiver process, and whether or not, when students are remote, whether or not they will count those days when students are remote will count for the actual needed days, that 175. And so I'm wondering, Secretary French, if you could say a little bit about that. I think that it has risen to a real concern of folks.
Yeah, I did include some information on this in my press conference. So I'll sort of go through that again. We're not in a state of emergency. So and this is sort of a legal introduction to this context and I'm not a lawyer. But so we're operating under our existing regulations. So we have firstly a statutory requirement that schools be in session a minimum number of days each year. That's 175. You've made adjustments to that in the pandemic, but it's 175 days. And we consider that to mean when in the law is clear, it says when 50% of the students, a majority, it says, I think, majority of the students are present, that constitutes a day. So that's the regulatory environment we're operating, or the statutory environment. And then we have a regulation that's been around for a long time around waivers to that. That by again definition doesn't start till the second half of the school year. So the waiver process doesn't open in September. You know, the idea would be in many situations, for example, if a school boiler blew up, I'm thinking a couple of years ago in Chester, their boiler, and they had water problems and so forth. And a school gets through the first half of the year trying to figure out how to make up the days they lost. And at some point they realize that maybe they're not going to have enough time to make up the days. Sometimes, for example, school districts would shorten a vacation and so forth. If in the case where they wanted to pursue that, they would request a waiver of the State Board of Education, and the State Board would consider that and grant a waiver. So in the last couple of years, the State Board has given me that authority to adjudicate these waivers, since we've had to have greater tactical flexibility in response to COVID. So the difference this year compared to last year, because last year we were under a state of emergency, we enabled last year remote learning and the idea of going remote to qualify as an in-person day, essentially. We did that under the authority granted to me as secretary in the state of emergency, largely because of the public health context. It wasn't ideal, but we needed to do that in order to ensure some continuity of learning for students. Since we're not in a state of emergency now, we don't have any definition, particularly from a quality perspective, of what remote learning constitutes in order for it to count as an in-person day. And furthermore, there's, I would say, increased emphasis to try to keep kids in school as best as possible, particularly as the risks have come down with vaccination, and acknowledgement that there are cumulative impacts educationally to students for what's gone on in the last 2 years. And we need to put some energy on keeping them in school. So what I've messaged the superintendents is that waiver process, as it would normally, will open here sometime around February 1st, and I will be publishing an expedited waiver application process, essentially, and that I am inclined to be very flexible in the granting of those waivers, as I have done in the last 2 years. Where I've also messaged, and this might be the cause of some of the angst, and some of the concern is like, when's the waiver process going to be opened? And that I've been very clear as best I can on when that's going to happen. The other piece is I've been messaging that I'm not as sympathetic to the idea of preemptive school closures. And the classic scenario for that, which I'll give you an example of, one that I received during the Christmas holiday. I get an email from a superintendent and board members who are like, we're worried about the cases coming back from vacation, you know, because families have gathered. We think it would be prudent to close school in advance of any problems, not because of problems, but in advance of problems. And those kinds of scenarios I'm less sympathetic to. I certainly, if they do submit a waiver for that, I'll have to evaluate it. But I've been messaging I'm less sympathetic to preemptive closures as opposed to closures that are a direct result of COVID. And when I say direct result of COVID, I'm talking about, you know, students having COVID, you know, teachers having COVID, or teachers having to stay home. You know, workforce availability issues will probably be the better part of what we see for school closures as a result of Omicron. Those kind of circumstances to me are totally appropriate for a waiver, because they're real conditions of operation that necessitate school closure. So I'll be very sympathetic in that regard. But that's sort of the context. That application process will go live the end of January.
So Senator Chittenden and Senator Hooker.
Secretary French, thank you for that. So I understand we were in a state of emergency last year and we no longer are. So that I just heard you state that we are guided by the statute that defines the school year as 175 days. Could you just clarify if that's a state statute, and is there an avenue here where, if it is a state statute, if the legislature wanted to take it upon ourselves, similar to what we just did for town meeting day, waiving petitions and also giving more flexibility, is there an avenue for us to amend that to define it as 165 in-person days with up to 10 remote days in order to give our school districts more latitude, and also maybe less processing time of all these application waivers? Could you give us an idea of how rigid that 175 day statute is?
Yeah, the 175 defines the number, that's in state law, and you have modified that at least on one occasion, I think twice now during the pandemic. Lost track a little bit, but I know at least once because it happened in August. Where it becomes more challenging is defining what is a remote learning day relative to constituting those days. That would take some work. You could certainly make an adjustment to the number of days. I don't necessarily have an opinion on that yet. As we rolled into the fall, it wasn't clear to me how long Delta was going to last. I mean, some of our, into Dr. Levine's, modeling plan, we had modeling on Delta that said 9 weeks, but here we are. So, but again, waiver isn't available in September anyway. So people started asking pretty much right off, what are we going to do? And I was like, well, we have to wait to see what the pattern's going to be, but the waiver process itself isn't available in regulation until the second half of the year. But I think I would be concerned about a quick definition of remote learning, because that has been all kinds of things in between. And my wife's a teacher as well, and I get to watch that play out during the pandemic at our dining room table. The remote learning has been very unequal across the board at different grade levels. It's looked like totally different things. So I'd be very cautious. It's particularly this point where we start to consider the cumulative impact of the pandemic. I'd rather personally secretary retain some tactical flexibility around the waiver process before we jumped in and tried to define remote learning. I think remote learning is something that the General Assembly should put some time on at some point, not in the middle of a pandemic, and really seek to define, because I think it'll be exceedingly useful, especially for a rural state like Vermont. I struggle a bit with the quality and equity of it. It was not lost on me, for example, on Monday when I got calls both from Winooski and Springfield that they were going to close for a couple days. And those are communities, as you know, that have higher needs students, socioeconomic needs students, and First American students. It wasn't lost on me that those two districts of more needy regions of the state were the first ones going remote, and most likely would struggle with standing up a robust remote learning opportunity very quickly. So I think we have to be very cautious about equating remote learning automatically with in-person learning, especially at this point.
Senator Hooker.
Thank you. So we did remote learning last year. Schools did it. And there are some schools, I understand, that when they close, go to remote learning. So what happens when, teachers have been teaching during those remote learning days, and then, they haven't met the 175-day requirement for in-person learning? What does that do to contracts? And
yeah, that's a whole nother dimension. But I think the way to think of it, again, sort of in a legal definition to this issue, schools are either open or closed in our statutory language and in our regulatory language. That's the historic sort of disposition. You're either open or you're closed. It doesn't really matter when you're closed if you're doing remote learning or not. It's the school is closed. So, the issue then becomes of waiver. Will the school have to make up the days or not? And what we've done in the last couple of years, certainly under the state of emergency, we've counted remote days as being in session days. And to a certain extent, you mentioned contracts. I think districts have negotiated side agreements during the time period to iron out issues of working conditions and workloads and stuff like that. So it might be interesting for you to take a look at some of those documents to understand the patterns. But this year, we're operating in the existing statutory and regulatory framework, and that is schools are open or closed. School districts, and also likely because families have been conditioned to expect some continuity of education services when schools are closed. Schools have been using remote learning technology during those days to keep the process moving forward. But again, those days, whether they're doing remote learning or not, would count against them unless a waiver is granted. And part of, I think, and it's a pattern that I've noticed across the country, is we're as folks in charge of education systems are pushing back on that a little bit. We don't want schools to pivot into remote learning very quickly. And what we saw during the pandemic, the school would get one case and they would shut down, the whole school. And or they would, back in the early days of the pandemic, close the school for a day for deep cleaning would be another example. Those kinds of circumstances don't exist anymore. So we really want to be, I think, from my perspective, more cautious on incentivizing remote learning to be used as a mitigation tool with the virus.
So may I follow up on that, just so I'm clear? So if a school, and this might not be common, were to close for a week or 2 weeks.
Yeah,
you're
that's
saying
unusual.
Right, that is unusual, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And if we were to get to that point, so we're really talking about a day or two, but if it's 3 or 4 days, we're encouraging teachers to still teach remotely, or those are really days where kids could just sort of be off on their own, not having academic work?
Yeah, I think, it's an interesting topic, so I appreciate you calling it up. It's what we saw. I think it's fair to say what we saw in the fall of this year was not necessarily whole schools closing. You saw grades closing. And
Okay.
so you had, and back to the definition in the law, if 50% of the students are present, that's a day that counts. So we saw a lot, firstly, the fall the story is really about elementary schools, not high schools. So high schools have been operating very continuously. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a high school that has been closed for several days around the state because of COVID. They very well could be, a small high school might have been closed due to staffing outages or something like that, but that's infrequent. We're really talking about elementary school. And elementary schools, the common pattern in the fall, in the early phases of Delta, was a grade going out. Like grade 2 is out for whatever,
Right.
14
Right.
days. In that kind of scenario, the school is counting that day of instruction, right? So you have less than 50% of the students out. That school checks the box; they're complying with state law. You do have the issue of how to ensure the educational continuity of those students who've been out, but it's not a waiver issue. It's not necessarily something that the school's provisioning remote learning for, though I'm sure some did. But now I think what's happening now, particularly sort of this later phase of Delta now with Omicron, is schools will be closing due to staff shortages, probably more so than that they closed earlier. So we've already started to see that play out a little bit. It's not necessarily a case of grade 2 going down because of contact tracing and so forth, because, as we've described the new process, you're really expanding the testing, you're expanding sort of the broader definition and assuming everyone's a contact more or less. What we're going to find, and we're already starting to see, is that whole schools will be closing as a result of staff availability issues. If that's the case, those staff are, if they're sick in particular, they're unlikely to be available to teach online either for remote learning. So you're going to have that sort of dichotomy play out. So this is where I think the waiver process is exceedingly going to be useful. So districts will have the option whether they're going to be making up those days or not. The contractual implications, to the point Senator Hooker raised, and those are important ones, but those are also ones that will probably be addressed locally, inappropriately locally through the collective bargaining process. That's my thinking as of January 11th at 4:13 p.m. This is, this is an evolving situation, and the patterns are not clear to me. Back to the patterning or modeling, we'll see what happens, so to speak. But what's appearing as a national pattern is certainly a Vermont pattern. Is the priority is to keep schools open as best we can, and to try to carry on through this Omicron moment, which is, again, part of the rationale for adjusting the processes of contact tracing and testing. So we have to stay committed to doing that. But it is, as you know, I'm sure you'll hear if you haven't already, the staffing patterns are pretty fragile right now in schools, and it doesn't take much to tip these organizations into a closure disposition if the right number of people are out for a number of reasons.
Unless I see other questions, I think we'll leave it there for the day. Any final comments, Secretary French or Dr. Levine, at this point?
No, thank you for the opportunity to come in and provide an update. We've got a lot of work to do this week to refine our written documents. So
Right.
we'll send those your way so you'll have them, and be happy to come back in and address any other questions.
Yeah, please, as much as you can send us, that would be great. Appreciate also your willingness to come back in, and also appreciate everything that the two of you and your staffs are doing as this continues to evolve and we try to address this, putting children first and foremost. So thank you both.
Good afternoon.
Take care.
Committee, tomorrow we will hear, we'll continue the conversation with Dr. Lee, as well as those organizations that represent superintendents, school boards, principals, et cetera. And, but for now, unless I see pressing questions, I think we'll leave it there. And I think one of the things that's going to be asked of us, and we should be, I guess, thinking about a little bit tonight, is where are we all with what we're learning? In other words, are people comfortable? Are they uncomfortable? Is there legislative action that this committee believes it is responsible for taking at this point, or are we satisfied with the direction and how the pandemic is being managed by these two agencies? I would say, of course, we'll learn more tomorrow when we hear from other advocacy groups. But for now, I think we do have quite a bit, and I'll be looking to all of you to see how you're feeling. So.